The heat came early that summer, settling over evergreen lakes like a suffocating blanket. By noon, the concrete shimmered and the air pulsed with stillness. That's when I decided it was finally time to drain the pool. We'd put it off for 2 seasons. Between work, raising our daughter, and the general chaos of post-pandemic life, the once sparkling water had turned cloudy, with green threads of algae curling around the tiles. It wasn't just unsightly, it was embarrassing. And so, I rented a sump pump, rolled up my sleeves, and prepared to spend the day restoring a small part of normalcy. My wife, Lexi, handed me a cold bottle of water as I connected the hose to the drain line. "You sure this won't cause any issues?" she asked, squinting into the sun. I shook my head. "I called the city last week. As long as we're not dumping chemicals and the water goes into the storm drain, we're fine." She nodded but glanced toward the street. "You know she's watching." Of course she was. 3 houses down, behind the trimmed rose bushes and the rigid white porch columns, stood the domain of Cynthia Reeds, though everyone in the neighborhood had long since dubbed her Karen. She was the HOA president, a title she wielded with the energy of a medieval warden. If a trash bin was visible 5 minutes past collection, she knew. If your lawn grew a quarter-inch beyond regulation, you'd receive a fine wrapped in a passive-aggressive newsletter. Lexi followed my gaze. "She's probably already writing up an infraction." "I'm not breaking any rules," I said, but I knew it didn't matter. Karen didn't need you to break a rule. All she needed was to believe you did. I turned the valve. Water rushed through the hose, pouring steadily into the gutter that led directly to the storm system. Within 10 minutes, the level began to drop. The algae slithered away from the edges. It felt good, like reclaiming control, until the sirens arrived. 3 police cruisers turned onto our quiet cul-de-sac, lights flashing. My hands froze on the hose. A few neighbors peeked from behind their blinds. One even came out with a phone already recording. An officer approached with urgency. "Sir, step away from the equipment. Is something wrong?" I asked, bewildered. "We received a call about an environmental hazard," he said. A report of someone illegally dumping chemicals into the public sewer." My mouth dropped open. "This is pool water. That's it. I checked the city code. I'm allowed to drain it as long as it's free of contaminants." "Do you have documentation?" he asked, not unkindly. "In the garage," I said, heart racing. "But I'd like you to shut it down while we confirm." From the corner of my eye, I saw her. Karen stood on her porch, arms folded, phone still in hand. Her expression was calm, satisfied. Lexi joined me, voice sharp with disbelief. "You call the cops on us for draining our own pool?" Karen didn't respond. She turned, sauntered inside, and shut the door. By the time the officers left, with a warning and a citation I'd need to dispute at City Hall, the water had barely dropped a foot. I stared at the still-churning hose, the quiet street, and the shadow of that door closing in smug triumph. "She's out of control," Lexi muttered. "This is harassment." "She wanted to make a statement," I said. "That she's in charge." And she was for now. But power gained through fear has cracks. Karen had crossed a line, and she didn't even know it yet. Because what she saw as control, I saw as fuel. And I don't back down when someone starts a fire in my yard. 2 days after the incident, I received an email from the HOA board. Mandatory appearance required. Violation of community environmental guidelines. The tone was formal, the language overly legalistic. At the bottom was Karen's name, signed with the flair of someone who thought she was more judge than neighbor. Lexi read it over my shoulder. "She's not letting this go." "No," I said, jaw clenched. "She's escalating." I spent the next 3 days gathering proof. I printed the city's environmental drainage code, highlighted every clause that applied to my case, and contacted the same city engineer I had spoken to earlier. He confirmed, again, that I had done nothing illegal, nothing even questionable. I requested his statement in writing. When Monday night came, I walked into the Evergreen Lakes Community Clubhouse with a folder tucked under my arm and a quiet fury in my chest. The room smelled like coffee and dust. Residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring among themselves. Some watched me curiously. Others avoided my gaze. HOA meetings weren't typically well attended, but word had spread. Karen had brought in the cops, and I was the man who'd stood at the center of it all. Karen presided at the head of a long table, flanked by 3 board members. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a red blazer as though this were a congressional hearing, not a neighborhood dispute. Her clipboard rested in front of her like a gavel. "We'll begin," she announced, tapping her pen against the table. "Mr. Chambers, please explain your actions regarding the unauthorized drainage of your pool." I stepped forward and placed my documents on the table, keeping my voice calm but firm. As I mentioned in my email, I followed city protocol. No chemicals were used. The water was drained through a proper outlet. I confirmed with a city engineer, whose signed statement you'll find on page 3. Karen didn't look down. Evergreen Lakes has its own standards beyond the city's. Our bylaws prohibit unsanctioned alterations to personal property that could impact neighboring aesthetics, safety, or community order. "That's a very convenient interpretation," I replied, "and completely vague." "The rules are intentionally broad," she said with a smile, "to protect the integrity of our neighborhood. To allow people like you to twist them into whatever suits you," I shot back. A murmur rippled through the audience. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're dangerously close to being cited for disrespectful conduct at an official meeting." "Go ahead," I said, stepping closer. "But know this, I'm not just here to defend myself. I'm here because I'm tired of watching you intimidate this community. You don't enforce the rules. You create them. You fine people over garden gnomes and holiday lights. You patrol the neighborhood like it's your personal fiefdom." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another stared down at the table. But it was the audience behind me that responded most. Claps. A few muttered agreements. One voice called out, "It's true. She fined us for a swing set." Karen tried to regain control. "This meeting is not about unrelated grievances." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because this pattern of overreach isn't isolated. It's a system. And you're the architect." She leaned forward, her smile brittle. "If you dislike how Evergreen Lakes operates, Mr. Chambers, perhaps you should consider relocating." Lexi stood up from the back. "Or maybe it's time for new leadership." That turned the room. I hadn't planned on it. But in that moment, I realized what needed to happen. I looked at Karen and said, "You're right. Maybe this is about more than just a pool. Maybe it's time we all had a say in how our community is run." Karen blinked, but her confidence faltered. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to threaten. All I had to do was shine a light. Because when people finally see who's really pulling the strings, they start reaching for the scissors. The morning after the HOA meeting, my inbox was flooded, not with citations, but with support. Neighbors I barely knew were reaching out. The couple from Lot 42 thanked me for standing up to Karen. She'd tried to find them for hanging wind chimes. A single dad from across the cul-de-sac shared how she threatened to report his kids for drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. One elderly resident said she'd been warned about her rose bushes being too expressive. It was like I'd tapped a crack in the dam, and now it was leaking faster than Karen could plug the holes. Lexi and I spent the next week organizing. We didn't whisper in shadows or sneak around. We hosted a barbecue, open invite. No permits, no RSVPs, no ridiculous application to gather forms. Just burgers, iced tea, and neighbors rediscovering they had something in common, frustration. That evening, we rolled out a petition. Not just to dispute the fine Karen had imposed on me, but to trigger a recall vote on her presidency. Within 48 hours, we had more than enough signatures. The board tried to stall. They claimed the petition was improperly formatted, that we hadn't followed the right channels. But I had studied the bylaws just as obsessively as Karen had weaponized them. Everything we'd done was legitimate. The showdown was set for the next HOA meeting, a full vote. Karen didn't show signs of worry, but I saw it in the tightness of her smile, the forced cheer in her voice. She doubled down, issuing newsletters about dangerous trends threatening Evergreen Lakes. She accused me, without naming me, of trying to dismantle the order and beauty of the neighborhood. But people weren't buying it anymore. The Nextdoor app lit up with testimonies. Photos of warning letters for minor infractions. Stories of unjust fines and awkward confrontations. The truth spread faster than her carefully curated paranoia. Still, Karen wasn't done fighting. 3 days before the vote, a man in a city vehicle showed up at our door. He claimed there had been an anonymous tip about a code violation, unauthorized electrical work near the pool area. Lexi handled it. "There's no work being done," she told him. "No permits required because there's nothing to inspect." The inspector seemed annoyed more than anything. "We get a lot of these calls from this neighborhood. Always anonymous. Always false." He left with a warning. Next time, there could be a fee for false reporting. I smiled at that. Karen had tried to bury us in bureaucracy. But now the red tape was wrapping around her ankles instead. On the night of the vote, the community clubhouse overflowed. Folding chairs ran out. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Even residents who never came to meetings showed up with folded arms and focused stares. They weren't just there for me. They were there for themselves. Karen sat in her usual spot, clipboard in hand, trying to command the room with her usual passive authority. "Let's keep tonight's meeting civil," she said. "We'll hear both sides, though I think we can all agree that the recent negativity has been a drain on morale." I stepped forward. "You mean the truth?" She ignored me, launching into a speech about pride, standards, and protecting property values. But it didn't land the way it used to. People shifted, rolled their eyes. A few whispered. When it was my turn, I didn't yell. I didn't rant. I read aloud the HOA rules, line by line, and pointed out every time Karen had bent or broken them. I listed the bogus citations, the threats, the selective enforcement. Then I passed the mic. "Lexi." Then the man from Lot 42. Then the widow whose garden had brought her joy until Karen told her the colors were too bold. By the time the vote came, it was no longer about me. It was about us. And the tide had turned. The ballots were counted in silence. One of the board members, now clearly ready for change, announced the result. Karen Reeds, HOA president, officially recalled. The room didn't erupt in cheers. It sighed. A deep, collective exhale. The sound of a weight being lifted. Karen stood, stiff and composed. She gathered her clipboard, nodded curtly, and walked out without a word. The queen had been dethroned. But there was one more move left to make. Karen was gone from the board, but not from Evergreen Lakes. And I knew someone like her wouldn't retreat quietly. Power was an addiction, and she'd been mainlining control for years. So I waited for the retaliation, the drama, the next passive-aggressive move. But it didn't come. Instead, the silence grew. Not peaceful, not calm, just restrained, like the eye of a storm holding its breath. 2 weeks after the recall vote, I was officially appointed to the interim HOA board by a unanimous community vote. Lexi and I had spent days drafting a revised charter, one that limited the scope of fines, demanded transparency, and created a new committee focused on mediation over punishment. For the first time, residents were encouraged to participate, not just comply. Still, I didn't forget what Karen had done, or what she might still be capable of. Then, just as things began to settle, it happened. I came home from work to find my backyard flooded. Not just damp, but soaked. The pool was full, but the surrounding yard was ankle-deep in water, mud swallowing my lawn furniture, flower beds drowned. It didn't take long to find the cause. The drain valve, normally locked and covered, had been tampered with. The hose redirected to backfeed into my irrigation system. Someone had reversed the flow. Someone who knew exactly how the setup worked. Lexi stared at the mess, jaw tight. "You think it was her?" I didn't even need to answer. She was careful. No fingerprints. No cameras caught her in the act. But the message was clear. If she couldn't sit on the throne, she'd poison the well. So I called the police. This time, it was me on the line. I showed them the valve, the flooding, the damage. I explained the history, the threats, the false inspections. But what really helped was the HOA's new complaint system, implemented just a week before. Every grievance had to be submitted under a verified name and address. And tucked inside the admin portal was a pending report, submitted under Karen's name 3 days earlier. Neighbor's pool draining system poses serious structural risk. Might require testing. That was all the police needed. It wasn't proof she'd trespassed, but it was motive, timing, and a paper trail. She was issued a warning and a no-contact order. If she came within 10 feet of my property again, she'd be arrested. Not just fined. Not just scolded. Arrested. The final thread snapped. A few days later, a moving truck appeared outside her house. Quiet as ever, Karen packed up and left Evergreen Lakes. No sale sign, no farewell. Just a clean cut from a place that had finally grown tired of her tyranny. The neighborhood changed after that. Slowly at first, like thawing ice. People waved more. Front yards got brighter. The chalk art returned on sidewalks. Lexi even started a weekend craft circle on our porch. The rule book was still there, but now it lived in service of the people, not above them. One afternoon, while replacing the soil in our flower beds, I heard footsteps approach. Need a hand? It was Jeff, the guy from Lot 42. He was holding a shovel and 2 iced teas. I smiled.
Sure.
I could use a second opinion on color coordinating mulch. He laughed and knelt beside me. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't drained that pool? All the time, I said, pressing fresh roots into the earth. Sometimes the smallest act reveals the deepest rot. Lexi stepped outside, wiping her hands on her jeans. So, no regrets? I glanced around at the quiet buzz of weekend life. Lawnmowers humming, kids riding scooters, someone grilling in the distance without fear of citations. None, I said. She called the cops over water. Now she's the one who got washed away. And with that, I turned on the hose and let the water run, clean, free, and unbothered. Just like the neighborhood we had finally reclaimed.